huge amount of vested interest, and also in terms of invested money, sort of infrastructure and stuff, to be able to change from the way that we had set up, which is hugely geared towards using fossil fuels. The amount of investment is not just sort of changing a few things, it's actually a whole paradigm shift. So the course needs to be really mapped out, and I feel that people are looking for barriers to making the first step rather than trying to make a strategic roadmap of where they should be. I feel that the economic consideration thing is a little bit difficult when looking at the Stern report and seeing that if 2% of global GDP was spent, then that would mitigate 5% of global GDP being lost to climate change. So that means you've got 3% of global GDP which will be saved through this investment. So in terms of money, I think there have to be ways of looking to invest these things, but because of the vested interest and the unwillingness to accept these changes, it's very difficult to free up the necessary capital.
If you take an example like public transport though, for me to get from here to Manchester on the train would cost about 70 quid.
Yeah.
And for me to get from here to Poland would cost about 25 via Ryanair. And so you kind of end up thinking like, you know, for me to drive maybe it costs 40, 30 pounds in petrol.
Yeah.
And so people, if you can't afford it, it seems so expensive, it's such a barrier.
Which is why at these meetings in Copenhagen and stuff, most of the world leaders from Western countries just think, no, we can't guarantee this, we're going to put as many emissions as we can. And in some respects it's so harsh to say, but I suppose people do try and keep Africa and India down. If you're representing your own country, you think, I'm going to think about myself and, you know, and my people, aren't you? You're not going to think about an international view, which I think is wrong. I think we should all think internationally and try and help everybody.
In a developing or emerging economy where there's less of that infrastructure, there's the potential, because they're adding capacity at a huge rate, they can, instead of adding coal, they can add, I don't know, wind, water, hydro, or even nuclear if that's your thing. But the problem is it's more expensive.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's why they really need, one of the most crucial things this week and next week is they need to have a big fund, so that developing countries who are trying to expand their power capacity, like power generation capacity or whatever, can access that clean technology without having to sacrifice spending on healthcare or education to do it.
Yeah, do you think that like maybe people are disincentivised from investing in places like Kiribati and Maldives at the moment because like, well, is there any point in me building a hospital here if it's going to be underwater in 5 years' time? Because like it's sort of we have to consider whether it's a coincidence that like these are places that are in great poverty. These are places where like people don't have enough to eat and they don't have enough water, and it's those are the people who are going to suffer the worst from climate change. Like I don't know how much attention, like I know Europe people have been paying a lot of attention to the campaign for climate justice. Like I think that's something that we would hope that world leaders would take into a special account, given that it's, you know, those are the people who are actually emitting the least at the moment.
It needs to be taken note of that as well. It's not just island nations, because there's a lot of discussion in the climate change skeptic circles that's like, oh, these trivial little island nations or whatever. But there's, huge countries like Bangladesh, which lies on a floodplain, and that's like 200 million people in one country alone. If we don't have action soon, then say in 5 or 6 years' time, people will start going, nothing's really changed, because they don't realise that it's changing elsewhere. So you need to take action now while everybody's aware before. Yes. You, in a sense, almost need to trick them. You need to convince them that what's happening dramatically elsewhere could happen here tomorrow, even though it won't for 10 or 15 years, because otherwise they just don't buy into it.
Everyone's looking for a sign that climate change is really happening. And it's sort of like the analogy of, say there's a pond and there are lily pads growing across the pond, and so every day it doubles the amount of lily pads on the pond, and say it takes 40 days for the pond to be covered. It's not until the 39th day that everyone sees, actually, God, half of the pond is covered, and then you've only got 1 day to sort it out. And it's this sort of worry that everyone's looking for a Pearl Harbor moment, as they're talking about in the US, or something really obvious to happen. Yet that won't happen until you've only got one, well, the sort of a really short space of time to be able to sort everything out.
To start things off again, maybe on the issue of developing nations' sort of need and desire to develop versus the global need for cutting the carbon emissions, fueling climate change. How can that actually be addressed or approached?
Global price on carbon at $40 a tonne, and then having each country allocated with a certain amount of emissions, and then you could actually be putting money towards developing countries, and because they're not developing into producing things through fossil fuels and they're producing things through renewable technologies, they can actually use the money and sort of it'll be an international trading scheme where the money's generated in the West and reallocated to developing countries.
And even though, say, China's the largest emitter now, per head it's quite low, or India's number 4, and the Prime Minister last week says, yeah, I really want to bring down carbon emissions, but how am I going to sell that to 60% of the population who only have one light bulb? How do we do this? So if you put that money aside and it's invested in clean technologies, then it can actually accelerate growth, because that's what millions of jobs, building dams and wind farms and whatever. They're just, I think personally, the only way you're going to get everybody to agree is if there's a lot of money.
If you've got it per capita, then it's not necessarily looking back and be a sort of retrospective tax. It's just we've developed to this certain level, and just by virtue of having had that level of development, you're at a much higher level of carbon consumption per capita, and so you'll have to pay now just by virtue of having that whole lead time of development, but it doesn't have the connotations of being a retrospective tax, which you can probably sell much better, because it does also sort of disincentivize the developing nations from using fossil fuels, because they will still be taxed, and so you can stop the Western government saying, oh, actually it's quite bad because these developing nations are still polluting.
In terms of actually driving awareness, increasing awareness, what can be done?
I think we're talking about how developing nations are emphasized to concentrate more on global warming, but I think the main thing right now is probably concentrate on the few of the biggest developed nations. Like the US is not taking part in the Copenhagen Agreement yet because it's economically maybe understandable because of the financial crisis and everything else, but economically it just doesn't make sense for them yet for now. But they have to, I think, countries like that have to sacrifice a little bit of their economic status and then concentrate on the global this warming area, and then other countries can follow. As other countries follow in their financial institutions, or for the US and UK, it's biggest, and other countries follow that. But if they can lead in the right direction, and I think developing countries will be able to do that as well.
For the developed world, the main thing that's going to be achieved is probably getting individuals to cut back. Whereas for the developing world, it will be that the infrastructure that's put in place is renewable, and so you don't actually need grassroots knowledge of it, because what's being put in place is already much better for the environment and much better and green, so you don't actually need to know why this decision has been taken. But where there are high levels of consumption, you need the individual consumer to cut back. You do actually need to have the media alongside.
And I say that for developed nations, if they can create an incentive for each of their individuals, like let's say if you get a hybrid car, then you can get a tax cut or a bonus cut for bankers after the news here in the UK. But then that will push people on the individual level to do what is better for the worldwide level. and that could be worked well for the developed nations. In the developing nations, I think most of the people do not have the resources or the funds to do that on the individual level. But I think on the government level, they could do that. So the government can think about how they spend their money and get international support on getting clean technology and other resources from the developed nations.
Although I agree that it's helpful when the media is in unison behind an issue, I think there still has to be open and rational debate which is transparent to the public in order for us to be able to become convinced by either side and to be able to put our own efforts behind it.
The other issue with the media is that the media landscape has changed immeasurably since the Second World War. So now, the idea of trying to get the media behind something wouldn't happen because on the internet you always have people arguing the other side of the story. It's kind of an impossible task.
But on the flip side, that also allows for far wider dissemination of a single message rather than relying on one wire agency or one reporter in one newspaper in days gone by. You had Earth Hour, for example, which was pretty much a global campaign. Over here, we ran the Time for Climate Justice campaign, which got 10 million petition signatures worldwide. So it's, I think the fact that there's, not as much singular control over the media needn't be a bad thing in this context, because, it allows you to get your message, if you feed it into the right channels, out to a much wider audience than would have been the case before.
So it's quite difficult for people to see themselves as a member of the human race rather than a member of a sort of a nation state. I think that there's so much sort of vested interest and barriers to seeing it as a global problem, just in the way that people conceive themselves and identify themselves, that unless there's sort of quite a large shift in people's mentalities, it's very difficult to be able to get collective action, because everyone's trying to look after their little pot of earth, their nation.
Everything that gets made should have a carbon cost, some sort of indicator of what that product's cost was to the environment. When you buy an iPhone, you have no idea where those parts came from. So maybe some sort of traffic light system like you get on food, saying actually this product is not great for the environment because the parts had to be sourced from all across the world. It came together and then it's been shipped halfway across the world. That sort of stuff. I think some sort of indicator of how much what you're buying is affecting the environment. We have no idea.
If we had a wish list for the kind of characteristics of any structure for combating climate change, bearing in mind that even though 10 years is the point where it becomes reversible, whatever system we impose, it's not like we're going to have it for 10 years and that'll be fine. We have to have this forever.
Yeah.
We have to find some agreement that's realistic in that it recognises that humans are a naturally acquisitive species. We want things, we want stuff, and doesn't infringe on our freedoms too much, and so creates an environment or a structure in which we can continue to act roughly the way we do, without doing too much damage. And so that relies then on the energy we use being clean, so that we don't need to make huge, which, I mean, I'm sure many of us would say we'd be happy to do, but it's very difficult to get most of the people to say, yeah, I'm going to turn the light off for most of the time.
What can we actually expect from our leaders here?
Maybe the global cut-off time after which burning fossil fuels and carbon is illegal, and actually have a proper date set after which
every country sign up for that. Would developing countries who can't afford to, talking about developed countries can't even afford to do anything about the environment at the moment, let alone developing countries who just...
I think the punishment for carrying on with trade embargoes and severe economic sanctions.
Even more trade embargoes,
Then, no one will trade with you if you burn fossil fuels.
There's got to be consumption control, and we're talking about sustainability. What we've got at the moment is in no way sustainable, and so unless the more developed countries actually have quite a serious ramping down of their particular consumption. There are no answers at all.
Who should be targeted, how, etc.
Maybe an international pool of experts who can then give facts that are seen as impartial, drawn from a large spectrum, so that they can then go to the media of any country and be able to give the facts. It's not they're then focused into delivering a message, because at the moment it's much too disparate and dispersed, and all these different messages are coming from different places. If you manage to get a panel of experts who can actually map out the facts of what's happening, I think that would be a hugely productive thing, in terms, because they can then be challenged and be able to answer the questions, and yet their impartiality is not going to be questioned because they're drawn from a lot of specialisms and they're top people in their fields. Going back to sort of the supermarket analogy from the first workshop, maybe that if you had a hierarchy of products, for which is the best one in terms of its carbon intensity down to the worst one, in terms of shelving. So you turn up where you could visually see, okay, these ones are actually the most sustainable, they're the ones that have use the least carbon in their production. So in the way that your consumer choices are sort of laid out, you can walk into a supermarket and very obviously just walk along shelves and pick the top ones, and everyone will be wanting to be that number one product, and so it sort of becomes something that people move towards and strive to be the best product for that particular area.
Getting mass retailers on side.
Products need to be made that appeal to the existing demographic whilst being efficient. They don't need to appear like special.
Literally, it's the message. You can, because like I said, people do only listen to whatever's going to save them money in their pocket, and which they can then use to go on that holiday, whatever it is. So if you literally just said, you need to find it go hand in hand. So not just promote green, but not only promote some money saving. There's got to be, so people that know it have got to dumb it down and then therefore make it accessible to people who don't. And then maybe you'd get some sort of change, because if people think like this, they're not making an effort when doing it, then they'll do it.
And I think part of the education needs to be from sort of an objective body or source, because at the moment there's a lot of different groups using various bits of research to support their cause. So it's, it's like the banking industry talking about how great banks are, and then there's another industry talking about how horrendous banks are. It's those who live and breathe think, look, we really need a change, are going, look, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And then there's people going, well, hang on, there's this bit of research that you're not using, but we're actually using, which says this. So there needs to be sort of some sort of objective sort of body or sort of understanding, rather than environmentalists talking about the environment.
Maybe have a positive thing to aim towards then, a sort of positive vision of society. So what it will look like in terms of energy production, all of these things, instead of having a negative, oh well, actually Bangladesh will be underwater and Tuvalu will be underwater. Say, well, you will be producing energy off your own house, you'll be making money back from the feed-in tariff, that you will be sort of benefiting because things will be grown local, so just if you put it and say, we can all do this, we can all move towards something that's much more positive, that's going to benefit you because you'll be paying less.
The deadline for mindset changing is when our generation and the kids who are like 15, 20 years younger than us, when they have their own children, mindsets have to be changed by that point, so that then the next generation are brought into a world where the mindset is, you have a carbon-free mindset, if that's possible.
That's a realistic trajectory.
I think a better example is we were all probably in this room brought up to wear seatbelts. Our parents weren't. And the sanctions for wearing seatbelts, you never really hear about. No one knows what the fine is, because it's there, but no one really gets fined anymore because we're all brought up to wear seatbelts. In every country, everywhere, in every little part of the world, we need to find some example of something. Just think that will go back, that will go wrong. Or because it's no good saying, like you said, Bangladesh, Tuvalu, whatever, they're going to go underwater. We need to find, say, some species in Britain or or people are a bit bored now by which species are going to disappear, but something like
which cliffs are going to fall
which
down.
cliffs are going to fall down.
Yeah.
People change their the way that they act not through top down seeing the government. It's from their peer group. So it's from their friends changing their habits, and so unless they're enlightening people going out there and actually doing things and changing their friends' habits, I don't think that there's going to be any change at all.
Genuine town hall meetings, like parliamentary constituencies, are way too big. If councillors took everyone in their ward and had a town hall meeting, and literally that would be the most effective way of doing it, and they would be able to discuss and debate, and every town hall meeting could have someone from some expert panel to say, here are the facts. This is the best way that I think it could be done, because everybody would be reached by it.
If you take it to where the people spend most of the time, and if it's the youth, it's school, and when you're grown up, it's work. So if you target those two sectors, so from when kids are young, infiltrate the whole idea of recycling and all that sort of stuff. Like, say, make the government pass school initiatives, like from kids when they're like 6,